Okay, now this is my first go at PowerPoint, believe it or not. So belt and braces, you've got a handout as well. I will probably forget to switch on, in which case you have to shout at me. Okay, my topic, it is an extraordinary thing that Descartes' cogito argument is still being puzzled over. Philosophers seem to, maybe this tells you something about philosophers rather than the argument, but philosophers seem to be able to revisit this argument, argue about how long it is, how many parts it has, whether it works, well, what it requires, whether it works, how much background. Well, I'm just going to have another go, as it were, in that vein. So by calling it Ambulo ergo sum, I've slightly got you here under false pretenses, because my interest is going to be whether we can get a version of the cogito argument to work. Okay, so I'm going to take it that the cogito seeks to answer the question whether I exist. And in particular, it seeks to show that we can know of our own existence just from the conscious experience or act of thinking. So I'm going to take Descartes' cogito argument as an argument that shows that in answer to that question, can we know our existence just from the conscious experience of thinking? And the argument seeks to show that you can. That if a subject engages in thought consciously, judges on that basis their thinking, then they can rightly infer that they exist. And I'm going to use as my foil to go back to the argument. This is really what set me off thinking about it again. John Campbell's cogito skepticism, as we can call it. He thinks that the cogito does not provide us with a non-question begging way of knowing about our own existence. The reference to the papers on the handout. So my aims are going to be twofold. One is to argue, Pache Campbell, that there is a way of construing conscious thinking on which the cogito can be seen as a way of gaining knowledge of one's own existence. And two, argue that if thinking, I've reformulated this on the handout actually, argue that if thinking is such that we're thinking whenever it seems like it does when we think, then such knowledge is indubitable, as Descartes suggested. Okay, but we'll come to that second part right at the end. So first, let's look at our target argument and state Campbell's objection to it. So the target argument, as I suggested, has three parts. So into the answer to the question, how many parts does the cogito have? On this reading, it's got 3 bits. The first bit isn't a premise or a judgment, it's an occurrence. In particular, it's a particular conscious thinking. That then, the claim is, and this is Campbell's construal of it, grounds the judgment, I'm thinking. And once you've got the judgment, I'm thinking, then you can infer, I exist. And roughly speaking, Campbell's presents this argument with a dilemma that either we get the conclusion by begging the question, or we don't get to the conclusion. So let's look at the, as it were, the either fork of the dilemma. According to the either fork, not very elegant, 3, the argument begs the question, because 3, the conclusion that I exist, needs to be assumed in order for me to justifiably move from an act of conscious thinking to the judgment that I exist. So you need to have knowledge of your own existence, i.e. knowledge of the conclusion, in order to be justified in moving from 1 to 2, from that act of thinking to the judgment that I'm thinking. And roughly speaking, the grounds of this argument are the traditional Lichtenbergian grounds. How do I know that I'm thinking? Maybe all I know is there's thinking going on. There's, as it were, thinking occurrences. In order for me to know that the thinking occurrences are had by me, don't I already need to have some reason for believing that I exist? And if I need to already have reasons for believing I exist, then I can get my transition all right between 1 and 2, but I've begged the question. Okay, the or fork says, okay, well, maybe in response when they're worrying about the question-begging argument, when we say I'm thinking, we can take the first person here as a kind of perspectival indexical that isn't referential. It doesn't have any sort of referential import. You can't read off it that the subject exists. So actually, and it's very natural to think that we don't really think. we naturally move. We take it that our grounds for moving to the judgment I'm thinking when I'm undergoing a conscious act of thinking don't involve me particularly thinking about whether the thinking is had by something. But then the thought is, well, if we're going to have a non-referential, non-loaded, oh, I've got a little spot here. If we're going to have a non-referential, non-loaded I here, then we can't conclude that I exist. So if the cost of moving without begging the question from 1 to 2 is that I can't get to 3. Okay. Campbell compares this version, and that's his reconstruction of the cogito, compares it to Moore's argument and points out that it's got interesting parallels. Both arguments seem to have 3 components, the first of which is a psychological conscious occurrence, the second of which is an indexical or demonstrative judgment. In Moore's case, it's here's one hand and here is the other. So I see my hands, according to Moore's argument, and on that basis I can judge here is one hand, here is another, and then that gives me grounds for an existential conclusion. There exist external objects, hands. And the cogito, the 3 parts, a conscious experience again, an indexical judgment, I'm thinking, Diet Coke there, and the existential judgment as a conclusion that I exist. Okay, so that's it set out. Now, Moore's argument famously was thought to involve a problem of a very similar kind to the problem that we saw Campbell put to the cogito argument. Namely, that if it's okay to move from 1 to 2, it looks as though we're going to have to assume 3 on most readings of it. And if that's not the case, if we have a sort of unontologically loaded reading of the judgment, the indexical judgments, then we can't get our ontological conclusion. So again, we face the dilemma that either we get to the conclusion by begging the question, or we don't get to the conclusion. Okay, so this again is I'll just go through the either bit of the dilemma, that the transition from 1 to 2 can't be grounding. I mean, it's the familiar complaint with Moore's argument. Goes usually via the argument from illusion. I have a visual perception of my hands. I judge on that basis, this is one hand and this is another. And somebody says, but look, you can't move to the conclusion that external objects exist unless you assume something like that your visual experience is caused by your hands, because after all, you could have the same visual experience and it not be caused by your hands. It could be that you're hallucinating or suffering from an illusion. And if that's the case, it looks like you're going to have to assume knowledge of the existence of external objects along with your visual perception in order to move to your conclusion. Okay, and then the claim is, well, okay, you row back from that assumption and you won't have sufficient resources because you'll have lost, as it were, you've had no assumption of existence of objects. You've just got the visual perception. Won't you have to row back and take it that your judgment doesn't have existential import? When I've got this is one hand and this is another, I'm not taking it to refer to any external object. It might just be the chimera of my experience. Okay, so that's the parallel between the two arguments. In both the case of the cogito and in Moore's proof, we can object that a conscious experience is not in itself able to deliver up knowledge of objects. We need already to know that there's some object or self beyond the experience, as well, the other side of the experience, that's not a mere experience but actually exists. Okay, but Campbell points out that there's a now, well, around these parts, particularly, and down the M40, a damn near orthodox response to Moore's argument. And that is to say, well, it's true that on certain construals of the nature of visual perception, you need to be able to add on an assumption of causal source or what have you in order to draw your conclusion. But there's another way to construe our visual experiences. If we take our visual experiences to be, as it were, relational, or put us in direct contact with the object of our external world, then if we're actually seeing one hand and then another, that visual experience can ground our judgment without any independent premises or assumptions that this is a hand and that's a hand. So if, as Campbell puts it, the visual experience encompasses the external object, if it is the experience it is, only in the case when you've got a subject who bears a certain relation to an external object, then the experience is enough on its own without the side, without that assumption, it's enough on its own to generate knowledge of the existence of external objects, that external objects exist. Okay, and then he makes this intriguing remark, which he, as it were, delivers like a bomb and walks off. In contrast, in the case of the cogito, there seems no possibility of a disjunctive or relational understanding of your encounter with your thought, on which your encounter with the thought encompasses not just the thought, but the thinker. Okay, and my sophisticated response that I'm going to try and work out a bit is why? Why is there no parallel treatment in the case of the cogito? Why can we construe conscious thinking in such a way that it does encompass in some way, that it has a direct relation to the thinking subject? And if we could, would that be enough on its own, or wouldn't that, in parallel reasoning, be enough on its own to generate knowledge of the existence of the thinker? Okay, this Solvitur ambulando that's there because of Rory Madden. That's what he wanted me to call the paper. So I've put it in as a title. So the solution is in the walking. Famously, the phrase was used. I don't know if it was used by, well, it couldn't have been used by Latin, but it was attributed to, or the style of arguments was attributed to Diogenes the Cynic, who, on being told that motion was impossible and unreal, refuted it by getting up and walking across the room. Well, I'm not going to solve things so easily, but the thought is, let's think about activities of the self other than the activity of thinking. Let's think about, for example, walking or jumping. So my suggestion is it might help us to use the cogito argument and understand, this is more contentious, but Descartes' use of it, if we think about thinking as an activity of an agent alongside other activities of agents. So consider our experience of acts and activities, putting aside thinking for the moment, acts and activities of agents other than thinking. So consider a conscious activity of jumping, or a conscious activity of walking. I can do these. If I wasn't being filmed, I'd jump, but. Okay, my thought here is, let's think a bit about the way in which we view, first of all, our awareness of our activities, such as walking and jumping. And do we really have any reason to be more skeptical about the idea that our walks and our jumps, that our walking and our jumping are more outside our direct awareness, our capacity for direct awareness, than hands or cups or anything else are through perception? And also let's think about the relation we take to hold between actions and activities and the agents that carry them out. And roughly my thought is, if we can convince ourselves that there's no bigger problem in taking, I think there's less of a problem actually, but there's no bigger problem in taking my awareness of my action of walking or jumping as relational, as direct, as in some way that my awareness of my walking encompasses the walking, then on a certain view, and certainly Descartes' view of the relationship between actions and agents, there's no reason to think that the agent herself isn't also encompassed, as it were, within our experience of walking or jumping. So roughly the thought is, if you hold a direct awareness of action thesis and you hold a view of actions, as I put it, as modes of agents here, and by that I mean actions are ways that an agent is or as has been. I mean, when you see me, it would be very odd. Oh, that was more of a shuffle than a walk. But it would be very odd to think, I saw Lucy's shuffling across the room, but I didn't see Lucy. All that was apparent was her shuffling. We don't think actions. We think that when you see me shuffling, what happens is you see me undergoing certain changes, carrying out a certain set of movements, acting. Oh, and then the thought is, if you put those two things together, I mean, let's say you see me acting, let's say my action, like your hand might be, is you're directly aware of my action, then I'd say that's enough for you to be directly aware of me. Because what you're aware of is me walking, the walker walking. So if I haven't really argued for any of those things, and I'm not seeking to argue for any of those things here, what I'm suggesting is if you hold those things, and I can't see what clear impediment there is to you holding those things, despite the godlike Campbell's doubts about it, then we have the possibility of non-question begging arguments for our own existence, on the parallel that we have the possibility for non-question begging arguments for the existence of other objects. So here are my alternative arguments. We've backed off from the cogito because we're not quite sure how it works, but we think we might have another form, a sort of simpler argument. Ambulo, ergo, sum. There's a particular conscious walking. That's sufficient in a non-question begging way to ground the judgment I'm walking. Why? Because in consciously walking, I'm directly aware of the walking and thereby of the walker, and I infer that I exist. And then my jump version, I've got ego saliendo. This is Google Translate. Okay? Is it wrong? Oh, God. I tell you, if you put a comma in, you get a different answer. Okay, I'm jumping, therefore I am. I say to my students that when they've got a choice, that ceteris paribus, they should never use the phrase ceteris paribus. They should always say, all things being equal. And here am I, flouting my own rules. Okay, so a particular conscious jumping could ground, in a non-question begging way, the judgment that I'm jumping, and I could infer from that I exist. Okay, and then the thought is, well, if they worked, and if you can think of thinking as an activity of a subject along the lines that walking and jumping are, then cogito, I've done it again, cogito redux, we might have a non-question begging form of the cogito argument. Okay, the idea that there might be arguments that we should look at alongside the cogito arguments, in particular arguments from other conscious activities, doesn't start with us or here. It's already there in Gassendi's objections to Descartes. So Gassendi, this is an objection presumably with his obsession or concentration or focus on the cogito rather than the ambulo. Gassendi objects, Descartes could have made the same inference from any one of your actions, since it's known by the natural light that whatever acts exists. And this is Descartes' reply, which I'll read in full. You say that I could have made the same inference from any one of my other actions, but that is far from the truth, because my thought is the only one of actions of which I'm completely certain. For example, I can't say I'm walking, therefore I exist, so there it is, ambulo ergo sum, except by adding to my walking my awareness of walking, which is a thought. The inference is certain only if the premise concerns this awareness and not the movement of my body. Because it can happen, for example, in dreams, that I see to myself to be walking, but I'm really not doing so. And so from the fact that I think I'm walking, I can very well infer the existence of a mind that thinks, but not the existence of a body that walks. The same holds for all the other cases. Okay, for our purposes, there's three things to note about Descartes' response. The first is that his objection parallels the standard objection to More's argument. It's a kind of argument from illusion. We cannot know for certain that we're walking because we've erroneously had the experience of walking even when we're not. For example, when we're dreaming. The second thing to note is that Descartes does not deny that it's known by the natural light that whatever acts exists. So he doesn't dispute the idea that if you do know that you're walking, then you would know that you existed. And finally, the third thing I think to note about his response to the argument is that the emphasis for Descartes is that he denies that in the case of walking, in contrast to thinking, you know the act with certainty. You might be wrong. So what thinking gives you is certainty. It's not that walking doesn't give you independent grounds, non-question begging grounds for your existence, or at least that's one way. One way may be that actually Descartes is a skeptic about walking as an action. But if he's not, I mean, if walkings for him involve, as it were, some kind of thought of the mind plus a cobbled-on bodily movement, then he'd be, to some extent, a skeptic. So I imagined Merendi says, listen, Descartes, let's separate two questions. Let's separate the certainty question from the, well, I think we should, let's separate the certainty question. Let me just direct you on your handout. So it's page 4 at the bottom. Oh, very good. The certainty question from the question about whether your experience of acting can provide non-question begging grounds for existence claims. And if we're interested just in the first question, the question about whether or not the Ambulo argument can give you non-question begging grounds for your existence claims, then we've got a goer. We've got a reason through our experience of walking to believe that we exist. Now, certainty is another issue, and it's true that we may be wrong about whether we're walking. It may be that we are subject to an illusion, maybe we're just dreaming when walking and not walking alone. But in that case, you haven't got a conscious experience of walking. You've got something else, you've got an illusion of walking. Okay, a note, Merendi might say, certainty is quite hard to get hold of, Descartes. I mean, for example, let's say you started with an activity that wasn't an activity such as walking, which involved, as it were, movements of the body, but covert activities, such as supposing or questioning. In fact, we can be wrong about these things. We might think that we're supposing something, but whether or not we're supposing perhaps has certain conditions on it. We're not really supposing unless we're prepared, say, to use it in later arguments. But if we are experiencing supposing, then we can thereby know on that basis that we exist. So certainty has costs both on both sides of, as it were, the covert psychological, such as supposings, and the overt psychological, such as walkings and jumpings. Okay, we'll come back to whether thinking has a special capacity to secure certainty in a way that the other activities don't. But for the moment, I just want to do two things. So far I've said, look, if we had a direct experience of our actions in the way that the Mauryan might think I can have direct experience of my hand, and then we have available to us a form of cogito argument that can non-question beggingly provide knowledge of our own existence. I haven't said anything, and I'm not really going to say much about what arguments one might have for the claim that we have direct experiences of our actions, and so of us acting. But I can point out two things in much the same way. I mean, the first is much the same advantage of this view that is pointed out by the relationist or direct realist about perception generally. And that is, they can invite you to ask what your picture of the world would be if you didn't have direct experiences of your walkings and your jumpings and your dancings and the rest of it. I mean, it would turn out to be the case, wouldn't it, they ask, that you're in some way trapped in a bubble, a phenomenological bubble of action awareness, and never really get access. The action is, as it were, always something that's beyond our experience of it. Now, if you want to feel alienated by the veil of perception, go ahead. But if you want to feel really alienated, if you want a really problematic picture of the world, it is to imagine that same separation, not just from you and the external world, but from you and every one of your activities, covert and overt. Every action you carry out is somehow beyond your experience of it. Okay, so that's one advantage, is you could avoid that kind of picture decisively. You may be able to avoid it in all sorts of other ways, but you would bring that home if you accepted this view. And the other advantage of going for a view where, according to which we're directly aware of ourselves and our actions in acting, is that it does enable us to explain a certain number of phenomena that we seem to be able to, the certain kinds of errors that we generally take ourselves to be immune from. We don't tend to think, well, I know there's some walking going on, but I wonder if it's got an owner, and I wonder if that owner is me. Once you have a certain direct awareness of your walking, those questions in our normal run of things are taken as settled. And it would explain why those questions are taken as settled. Okay, finally I'm going to finish with some limits, as it were, and obstacles. The first thing somebody could say is, look, I really buy the Ambulo argument. I think that's a really convincing argument for anyone who's worried about whether they exist. Just tell them to as it were, take a walk. But it's not going to help with thinking, because we've got no reason to think that thinking is an activity of a subject. Isn't it something quite different? And again, I'm not going to try to present a well-worked out decisive argument for thinking as an activity of a subject. But I do want to urge that it's the sort of natural and common sense thing to do. I mean, note that if you say to somebody, what do human beings do? What do us lot get up to? Well, we walk and we jump and we dance and we talk and we think and we question, and then we dance again, and then we skip, some of us, not as often as I used to. It comes thinking, questioning, doubting, falls very naturally into a set of activities that are given as the answer to the question, what do we do? And what's more, it's built in. Again, I'm not going to build a decisive case, but if we look at how we qualify attributions of thought to people, well, we use pretty much the usual adverbs that we use to qualify all sorts of things. You can, as it were, think slowly. You can get interrupted thinking. You can, I can't think of any more adverbs. You can certainly think slowly.
Vigorously.
Think vigorously and trenchantly, and hopefully you can do all those things. In fact, one of the ways you can think I think is a natural reading of it, is you can talk. That talking is very often a way of thinking. I mean, it's a way of thinking, as it were, that we interestingly drape over a whole set of activities. I think there are probably lots of different ways of thinking. There are ways, for example, if I ask you to go over to think of the word snow is white in your own language. Okay, you could probably all do that. But very often you think in no language at all. So I think there are probably lots of different ways of thinking, and one of them is talking. Now, talking is obviously an activity, so at least we will have, as it were, stolen a march if we've got a clear case of thinking that is clearly an activity. And the other thing, I think, when one's worrying about whether thinking is really an activity of a subject, is what's the other picture? I mean, this is not an argument. This is an argument by giving your opponent an offensive label. So there's a kind of phenomenological glitter view. You know, that there could be, as it were, phenomenological stuff going on, unplaced and unlocated. You know, murky puddles, perhaps, on Alpha Centauri, where there could be thinking going on without there being any thinker. Well, maybe. But I'd really, in the end, what this comes down to is we need to have a decision. We need to talk about what thinking is, how to understand what we're saying when we say, as we always say of us creatures, what's happening when we're thinking. And it may be that conditions on what we're saying when we say we're thinking that aren't and can't be met by, as it were, phenomenological glitter. But they may be. Okay, a more, perhaps more worrying problem is somebody might say, look, I'll give you the cogito version of the argument. I'll accept that thinking is an activity. But you're not going to get anything as strong in your conclusion as your conclusion that I exist. You'll get an existential conclusion, but you're only going to be able to get the conclusion someone exists out of your argument. Why is that? Well, let's agree that we have, as it were, a conscious walking or a conscious jumping or a conscious thinking. Okay, and let's agree that having that gives the agent, the person who's undergoing this experience, direct awareness of an action. And because actions are modes of agents, given that direct awareness of an action is direct awareness of a way an agent can be, it gives direct awareness of the agent herself. But how do I know that that agent's me? Maybe you've got, as it were, you've latched on to an action, but it's somebody else's. So go back to the case when I said, if you watch me walk. The thought might be, look, that gives you direct awareness of an action through perception in this case. And that gives you direct awareness, if I'm right, of me. But how do I know that I'm not in the same position, as it were, in relation to myself? I've assumed that agent's awareness, direct agent's awareness an agent has in acting is such that it can only give her awareness of herself, and that it gives her awareness of herself in such a way that she knows it's her. But I haven't established that. And my response to that is, yes, that's right. I haven't established that. If you can have direct awareness of acting in acting, as it were, for free on the back of just acting, then that will give you sufficient grounds to ground the first person judgment. And now we've got both the existential component and the first person component. But I haven't given an argument for that. Okay, so 2 things to say to close. One is I need my computer, but okay. One is, somebody might think, but Lucy, what about Hume's intuition? Isn't this where all this, I mean, what Lichtenberg was getting at, what Hume was getting at, when we experience ourselves, don't we, as it were, find ourselves missing in some way? So Hume famously says, for my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, or light or shade, or love or hatred, or pain or pleasure. I never catch myself at any time without a perception, and can never observe anything but the perception. Okay, but I want us to imagine, I had a kind of made-up Hume quote, where I imagined him worrying that whenever we try to look for an object, we never find it. All we ever find are sort of shapes and colours. I stumble upon, a spherical square item that's blue or green, but I never get to see the object. Now, Hume could say that, probably would say that. But that's a skeptical view that isn't, as it were, it isn't leapt on as the natural and common sense way to report our phenomenology of the world. But I don't think his quotation about the self should be reported as the natural and common sense way to report our phenomenology of the world. I mean, the trouble is his list is wrong. If he said, whenever I enter most intimately into myself, I always stumble on my thinking and my walking and my talking and my dancing and my jumping and my supposing and my finishing, then, but I never come across myself, then I think, well, you've been there all the time. You have already come across yourself, and what you're asking for is, as it were, the self bare of any of its activities. And we don't experience objects, either if we're the producers of them or if we're receivers of information about them, bare without their activities. Okay, last remark. What about certainty? So we could stick with the Ambulo argument. We've got ourselves an independent reason to believe that we exist. Few. That's something we've done on a rainy Friday night. We can go home and tell our families it's okay, I exist. And then, but do we know it for sure? Do we get certainty? Could doubt come in? And the thought is, well, maybe the cogito argument will, maybe Descartes' right, that's the difference. The cogito argument will give us freedom from doubt because it'll give us certainty. Well, I think whether or not the cogito argument gives you certainty will hinge upon what you want to say about what it takes for it to seem to a subject as it seems to me when I'm thinking. If it's possible for there to be a piece of, equipment cobbled together in some basement somewhere to light up with phenomenology and come to undergo an experience that has a what it's like quality, that the quality we have when we're undergoing the cogito argument, then if somebody says, can we rule out that we're in that situation, that we're not a thinker thinking, but that we've got, as it were, we're just seeming to run through an argument, we're seeming to think, but not thinking. I mean, obviously, if seeming to think just involves thinking I'm thinking, then we're all right, because worrying that you're not thinking is thinking, and so you get your result. But if this, as it were, this non-thinking could be just like our thinking, then we can still be worried by the thought that maybe I'm in a non-thinking state. Okay, but we can comfort ourselves, I think, with the thought that, well, with the following: if we're in a position, as it were, to start the cogito, remember, with an act of conscious thinking, then at least we're in the position to finish it, with certainty. But if we're not in a position to start it at all because there's no act of conscious thinking going on there, well, then there's nothing we can do. We're in a bad situation. Okay, that's it.